Usually when we try to understand the human mind, we sort of fall back on whatever the technology of our era is, you know? Like
Mhm.
if you go back 200 years, the brain was basically the steam engine with building pressures.
Right, yeah. The whole Freudian pressure valve idea.
Exactly. And then today, I mean, we use computer metaphors for everything. We talk about processing power or memory storage or needing to update our mental software.
Which makes sense. It's how we contextualize complex systems.
Yeah, but the underlying assumption is always the same. We believe the brain we wake up with every single day, the hardware, is a known quantity. We assume it's just meat, neurons, electricity, and some simple chemistry.
And, well, let's be real, that's a very comforting framework.
Oh, totally.
Because treating the brain as this complex biological machine makes it feel solvable. It makes it feel entirely bound by the rules of classical Newtonian physics. Like, if you can just map the wiring, the logic goes, you could eventually understand the ghost in the machine.
Right. But what if that comforting framework is just a complete illusion? What if you suddenly discovered that the familiar software of your daily mind, like your personality, your deeply held memories, your absolute sense of being a distinct, separate you, was actually running on alien hyperdimensional hardware that you never even knew was there?
I mean, that completely shatters the dominant neuroscientific paradigm. If the hardware is actually operating on principles beyond classical physics, the entire definition of what constitutes a mind has to be rewritten from scratch.
And that profound rewriting is exactly what we are exploring today in this deep dive. We are looking at a genuinely staggering piece of writing from SpiralSeekr.
Yeah, an incredible publication.
It really is. For anyone not familiar, SpiralSeekr is this cross-disciplinary publication that operates right at the bleeding edge where technology, biology, and deep philosophy all intersect. They don't just look at how things work, they look at what those mechanisms imply about the fundamental nature of our existence.
And you can really see that specific editorial lens in the author's other works, which we've included in our source stack for today.
Yeah, they have this clear obsession with the extreme breaking points of human biology.
Right, like that recent piece they wrote on the biology of crying.
Oh, that was a fascinating one.
Yeah, they frame tears not just as an emotional byproduct, but as a literal biological evacuation system for stress hormones.
Yeah.
Like the body physically purging chemical anxiety while simultaneously administering its own endogenous painkillers.
It's so wild to think about it that way. And they also covered Stendhal syndrome, which is that bizarre, fully documented phenomenon where a person experiences acute, psychosomatic, distress-like palpitations, fainting, even temporary hallucinations, simply from being overwhelmed by profound art or intense beauty.
Exactly. The author is constantly asking, what happens when our biological container is pushed past its capacity? What do those moments of system overload reveal about the baseline reality we usually just take for granted?
Which serves as the absolute perfect preamble for their most ambitious work. Because the container breaking is the central theme of the text we are analyzing today.
Right, the main event.
So, published on April 26, 2026, the piece is titled The Quantum Geometry of Ego Death. And our mission today is to unpack a radical theoretical synthesis proposed in this article. We are going to explore how a microscopic chemical molecule, specifically a tryptamine psychedelic, can completely and utterly annihilate a human being's sense of self.
And to understand this, we're going to have to journey from standard textbook neurochemistry past the synapses and all the way down into the quantum mechanics of the brain.
Yeah. And doing that requires us to confront a pretty major deficiency in how science currently approaches human consciousness. The author starts by taking a massive swing at the foundation of modern neuroscience, specifically what they term orthodox psychopharmacology.
Right, so let's start right there.
Yeah, what exactly is the orthodox view? Like, if I go to university and take Psychopharmacology 101, what are they teaching me about how my brain works?
So the current dominant model is heavily reliant on the receptor binding theory, which is commonly known as the lock and key mechanism.
Okay.
At its core, the brain is viewed as this vast communication network made of billions of neurons separated by tiny gaps called synaptic clefts.
Right.
A chemical messenger like a neurotransmitter, which acts as the key, is released from one neuron, floats across that gap, and finds a highly specific receptor on the next neuron, which is the lock.
So serotonin is a key, dopamine is a key, and they only fit into their specific locks. And when the key clicks into place, a reaction happens.
Precisely. It is a highly localized, sequential, and deterministic process. Neuron A fires, releases a chemical, hits neuron B, which causes neuron B to fire.
Right.
And the author openly acknowledges that this chemical binding is a measurable physical reality. When we ingest a serotonergic psychedelic molecules like psilocybin, DMT, or LSD, they act as agonists.
Right, they mimic the natural keys.
Yeah, they undeniably have an incredibly strong affinity for a specific lock in the brain called the 5-HT2A receptor.
Yeah.
We can literally observe this happening in a laboratory.
Okay, but I'm struggling with the author's critique here then. Because if we can put a brain in a scanner, introduce a tryptamine molecule, and physically watch it bind to the 5-HT2A receptor, why does the author call this lock-and-key explanation woefully insufficient? I mean, we found the physical cause, we know the molecule, we see the receptor. Why invent a whole new level of quantum physics just because the person taking the molecule is having a really complicated emotional experience?
Your resistance there actually highlights the core friction point of the essay. It's not about the emotion, really. It's about the mathematics of scale.
Scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you were describing is the easy problem of neuroscience mapping the chemical interactions. But the author is pointing directly at the hard problem of consciousness bridging. Consider the scale of a classical chemical binding. It is a tiny, localized event. It is a few atoms shifting in a microscopic cleft between two cells in the dark space of your skull.
Okay, so it's a microscopic physical event.
Exactly. Now, compare that to the phenomenological effect of a massive psychedelic dose. Subjects don't report feeling a sequence of cells firing. They report encounters with ineffable, hyperdimensional realities.
Right. They report the sudden, boundless expansion of subjective awareness.
Yeah, the complete dissolution of time, space, and their own identity. The author is demanding that we address an insurmountable explanatory gap.
Because a sequential, localized chemical reaction simply cannot account for the instantaneous, non-local geometry of the psychedelic experience.
Exactly. The physical cause is microscopic and linear, but the effect is infinite and multidimensional. The scale just does not match.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, actually. It's sort of like saying you can explain the majesty of a Beethoven symphony by pointing out that a hammer physically struck a piano string.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like, yes, the hammer struck the string. That's the key turning in the lock. But just observing the hammer doesn't explain the emotional architecture of the music you're hearing.
It's a rather apt comparison. The author isn't denying that the key turns the lock on the 5-HT2A receptor. Orthodox science proudly points to that and says, look, the key turned, mystery solved.
Right.
But the author's asking the much more profound question, what is the actual door that just got opened?
Oh, wow. And to find that door, the text forces us to look beneath the synaptic cleft. We have to go deeper than the surface chemistry of the neurons themselves. Which brings us to a theory that honestly sounds like Arthur C. Clarke's science fiction, but it was developed by some of the most rigorous scientific minds of the last century.
Yeah, we are crossing the threshold here from biology into quantum mechanics. The text grounds its entire argument in a highly controversial yet mathematically robust framework known as the Orch-OR theory.
Orchestrated objective reduction.
That's the one.
This is the brainchild of Roger Penrose and Stuart. And just the pairing of these two men is fascinating to me. Like, Penrose is a Nobel Prize-winning mathematical physicist, famous for his work on black holes with Stephen Hawking.
Right.
And Hameroff is an anesthesiologist. Why on earth does a physicist trying to solve the secrets of the universe team up with a guy whose day job is putting people to sleep for surgery?
Because Hameroff was obsessed with the exact mechanism of consciousness. As an anesthesiologist, his entire profession revolves around this profound mystery. Administering specific gases completely turns off human consciousness, but it doesn't turn off the brain's baseline biological functions.
Right, the heart beats, the lungs breathe, the neurons are still firing.
Exactly. So where exactly is the switch that anesthesia is flipping? Hameroff realized the switch couldn't be at the level of the synapse. He actually looked at paramecia single-celled organisms.
Okay.
They don't have neurons. They don't have synapses.
Yeah.
Yet they can swim, avoid obstacles, find food, and learn.
Yeah, if they don't have a brain, what is controlling them?
Hameroff discovered they are guided by their cytoskeleton. Specifically, incredibly tiny cylindrical structures called microtubules. And when you give a paramecium anesthesia, it stops functioning. It loses its primitive awareness.
Wait, really? Anesthesia works on a single cell?
It does. Hameroff hypothesized that these microtubules were the actual seat of consciousness. Meanwhile, Penrose was writing books arguing that human consciousness could not possibly be computational.
Meaning what?
Meaning it couldn't just be complex math. It had to involve quantum physics. When Penrose read Hameroff's work, the two realized these microtubules were small enough to sustain quantum states.
Okay, let's zoom in on these microtubules for a second. If I look inside a single neuron in my cortex, what am I actually seeing?
Imagine the neuron as a highly complex branching tree. The microtubules are the internal scaffolding of that tree. They are these cylindrical lattices made of a protein called tubulin. For decades, classical biology viewed them as entirely dumb structural support.
Like the steel girders holding up a skyscraper.
Exactly. Just a rigid frame keeping the cell from collapsing into a blob. But Orch-OR proposes that these lattices are not dumb at all. Because of their incredibly specific symmetrical geometry, Penrose and Hameroff theorized that they function as biological quantum computers.
Wow.
Inside the hollow tubes of these structures, quantum superpositions are occurring constantly.
So we literally have quantum computers firing inside the scaffolding of our brain cells.
That's the theory.
But I mean, my baseline sober reality definitely does not feel like a quantum computing experience. It feels distinctly ordinary. I wake up, I remember my name, I perceive time moving forward in a straight line, and I feel completely separate from the chair I am sitting on. Where is the quantum weirdness?
That perceived ordinariness is the exact phenomenon that the author is dissecting. The text explains that in our normative waking state, the sober reality you just described, the quantum activity inside these microtubules, is heavily restricted.
Restricted how?
The author uses the terms highly orchestrated and rigorously compartmentalized. The quantum states are not allowed to interact globally. They are boxed in.
Okay, so the sober waking ego is basically like a massive corporate office building.
Let's go with that, yeah.
Every worker inside the building is a quantum state, but they aren't collaborating in a giant open-plan room. They're sitting in tiny, isolated, walled-off cubicles. It is highly organized, highly predictable, and strictly partitioned. The accounting department doesn't know what human resource is doing. They only communicate through very specific, heavily policed channels.
That captures the architecture perfectly. But we need to emphasize the energetic reality of that state. Maintaining those cubicle walls requires an immense amount of biological energy.
Right.
The you that wakes up and makes coffee, the localized ego, is not a passive state. It is an active, fiercely defended orchestration of boundaries. You exist because your brain is expending massive amounts of energy to keep those quantum superpositions isolated from one another. The limitation is your identity.
Wow. Okay, so my sense of self is quite literally just an organized system of isolation walls within my cellular scaffolding. That sets the stage for the big question then. If the ego is a tightly controlled set of quantum states trapped in these cubicles, what actually happens when you introduce a tryptamine molecule into that environment?
Well,
Because we already established that the key turns the molecule binds to the 5-HT2A receptor. But how does that surface-level chemical event reach the quantum computer inside the cell?
here is where the author bridges chemistry and quantum acoustics.
Acoustics.
Yes. When the psychedelic molecule binds to the receptor, it doesn't just pass along a chemical memo to the interior of the cell. The tryptamine molecule actually alters the electron cloud of the receptor protein. It changes the dipole moment, the electrical charge distribution of the cell.
Meaning it creates a mechanical, physical shift.
Exactly. This shift generates a distinct vibrational frequency. The text states that the introduction of these specific agonists initiates a cascading harmonic resonance within the microtubular network.
A harmonic resonance?
Notice the profound shift in vocabulary the author uses here.
Mhm.
We are no longer talking about binding affinity or sequential chemical reactions. We are suddenly in the realm of acoustics. The text explicitly defines the psychedelic molecule as an acoustic tuning fork for the brain's quantum architecture.
An acoustic tuning fork. I mean, that changes everything about how we visualize drug interactions. Imagine a massive, silent room filled with millions of rigid, ticking metronomes. They are all slightly out of phase, all ticking away in their own isolated little cubicles. That is the sober, highly restricted brain. Then, a single, incredibly powerful tuning fork is struck in the center of the room.
Right. And consider the physics of a tuning fork. When you strike it, you don't need to physically touch the other objects in the room to affect them.
Right, because the sound waves travel through the air, through the floorboards, and because of the physics of resonance, any object in that room capable of vibrating at that specific frequency will catch the vibration. Suddenly, all those isolated metronomes start to synchronize. They begin to swing together in one unified harmonic wave. The tuning fork forces them out of their isolation.
This highlights the immense difference between chemical signaling and harmonic resonance. A chemical signal is slow. It requires physical transport. It's like walking to each cubicle and handing someone a piece of paper.
Yeah.
But harmonic resonance propagates instantaneously through the microtubular lattice. It doesn't pass a message. It fundamentally, aggressively alters the energetic state of the entire cellular scaffolding all at once. The vibration cascades down the tubulin cylinders, dissolving the energetic barriers that kept the quantum states isolated.
So the chemical binding is literally just the hammer striking the fork, but the acoustic resonance vibrating through the quantum scaffolding is the actual psychedelic experience.
It is the mechanism that dismantles the cubicle walls, yes.
Which begs an enormous question of scale. We've been looking at this microscopically inside a single neuron. But the human brain is a galaxy of nearly 100 billion neurons. If this tuning fork strikes, and this acoustic resonance cascades through the structural scaffolding of billions of cells simultaneously, what does that look like at the macro level?
The author introduces a very precise physical term for this exact event. As the barriers dissolve and the resonance spreads, the brain enters a state of macroscopic quantum coherence.
Okay, let's break that down for everyone listening. Macroscopic meaning large scale, the whole brain. Quantum coherence meaning what exactly?
In quantum physics, coherence means that multiple independent particles or states lose their individuality and begin to act as a single unified wave.
Wow.
In the context of the brain, those billions of isolated quantum superpositions, the workers previously trapped in their cubicles, begin to phase lock across vast, disparate regions of the cortex. They synchronize perfectly. They are no longer a collection of localized parts. They operate as a single, frictionless quantum system.
And to ground this in observable neurology, the text connects this quantum phase locking to a major theory in contemporary psychedelic science, Robin Carhart-Harris's entropic brain hypothesis.
Yes, and it's a vital connection. Carhart-Harris proposes that under the influence of psychedelics, the brain enters a state of elevated entropy. The rigidly defined neural pathways break down, and the overall energy landscape of the brain flattens.
Wait, hold on. Stop. I need to push back on this because there's a serious contradiction here.
Sure.
Yeah, entropy in standard physics specifically means a descent into disorder, right? It's the law of thermodynamics. My coffee gets cold, a glass shatters, a system loses structure and becomes chaotic.
Sure.
But you just told me the brain is phase locking into mathematical quantum coherence. Unity and entropy are opposites. How can the brain be completely unified and highly entropic at the very same time?
That is a brilliant catch, and it's honestly where the author's synthesis is most elegant.
Ah.
You have to understand what is experiencing the entropy.
Okay, explain.
Think of the sober, localized brain like a rugged, deeply carved mountain range. Your daily thoughts, your habits, your strict personality traits, they're like water flowing down deep, ancient valleys. The water is trapped. It can only flow where the valley allows. This is a low entropy state because it is highly structured and predictable, but it's also highly constrained.
So the valleys are those cubicle walls. They force my thoughts down the exact same paths every single day.
Precisely. Now, the entropic effect, driven by the macroscopic quantum resonance, acts like a cosmic steamroller. It flattens the mountains. The rigid structures, the deep valleys, are utterly destroyed. That is the entropy. But what is the result? You are left with a vast, perfectly smooth, open plain. The water is no longer trapped in isolated valleys. It can flow anywhere, instantly, in any direction. The destruction of the local structure allows for absolute global connectivity.
Oh, wow. It's disorder of the walls, which creates perfect order of the whole.
Exactly.
And the text points to a very specific casualty of this mountain flattening process. The default mode network, or DMN, undergoes structural collapse.
The DMN is arguably the most important neurological concept when discussing the ego. The author defines the default mode network as the literal anchor of the autobiographical self.
The autobiographical self? Basically the narrator in my head.
Yes. The DMN is a network of interacting brain regions that is highly active when you're not focused on the outside world. It's the part of your brain that ruminates on the past, worries about the future, judges your social standing, and constantly tells you the story of who you are.
It's the voice that never shuts up.
Exactly. It is the ultimate orchestrator of the separation between you and everything else.
So when the tuning fork strikes and the resonance flattens the brain's energy landscape, the DMN physically loses its ability to maintain its tight, restrictive grip on your neural processing. It collapses.
It does.
And again, to a classical biologist, structural collapse sounds fatal, like a brain injury.
Orthodox science does view the collapse of the DMN as a temporary drug-induced malfunction, like a toxic delirium. But the author vigorously rejects that.
Right.
The text states, this collapse is not a descent into neurological chaos, but an elevation into a mathematically profound, hypercoherent state of unified processing.
It's the moment the workers in the cubicle farm look up and realize the walls, the ceiling, and the entire office building have just vaporized, and they are standing together in an infinite, perfectly unbroken landscape. They haven't died. They haven't lost their ability to process. They have just been freed from artificial limitation.
The chaos is merely the perspective of the dying ego.
Wow.
The ego perceives the dissolving walls as terrifying destruction because the walls are its entire world. But from the perspective of the broader biological system, the brain has leveled up to a state of absolute, frictionless interconnectivity.
So we have built the mechanical bridge here. We went from the chemical binding at the 5-HT2A receptor to the acoustic resonance in the microtubules to the quantum phase locking of the whole brain, resulting in the collapse of the default mode network. The physics are laid out.
Yes, the mechanism is complete.
But the million-dollar question remains, doesn't it? What does that actually feel like? How does a localized human being subjectively experience a hypercoherent quantum event of this magnitude?
The text shifts beautifully here, from physics into phenomenology. It states clearly, phenomenologically, this macroscopic phase locking is experienced as ego death.
Ego death.
Yeah.
It's a phrase that has been entirely co-opted by pop culture, honestly. People use it casually to describe feeling relaxed or having a minor realization about their career while camping.
Oh, absolutely. It's become a buzzword.
But the author is stripping away all that New Age baggage and defining it with brutal physical precision.
There is nothing casual about the state the author is describing. When those localized microtubular boundaries dissolve, the subjective illusion of a separate self is mathematically annihilated.
Annihilate.
Yes. The narrator in your head doesn't just quiet down. The physical architecture required to sustain that narrator ceases to exist. There's no you left to observe the experience.
The text says that the experiencer is plunged into a unified ontological field. Let's define that word for a second. Ontological. Ontology is the branch of philosophy that studies the fundamental nature of being, of what actually exists in reality.
Exactly. When the filter of the ego is removed, you are not plunged into a void of nothingness. You're plunged into the sheer, unadulterated field of pure existence.
Right.
And this leads to the author's most controversial and disruptive claim in the entire piece. The text insists, unequivocally, that the tryptamine state, this experience of ego death, is not a hallucination.
Which completely upends the entire medical classification of these substances. I mean, we literally call them hallucinogens.
You do.
The foundational medical assumption is that psychedelics break the brain and cause it to produce false data. You are seeing dragons or geometric patterns that aren't there because your visual cortex is misfiring.
And the author forcefully rejects that premise. If a hallucination is defined as a perception in the absence of external reality, the author argues that the psychedelic state is the exact opposite. Because the brain has achieved macroscopic quantum coherence, it is suddenly capable of processing a much wider bandwidth of reality.
Okay, let's try a metaphor here that fits the physics better. Imagine human consciousness as a standard radio receiver. For your entire life, the dial has been superglued to one specific frequency. Let's call it 98.7 FM, the survival channel.
I like that.
You hear traffic reports, threat assessments, and the constant chatter of your own anxieties. And because you've been locked on that station since birth, you genuinely believe that the broadcast on 98.7 is all that exists in the airwaves.
The very grounded analogy. And the psychedelic molecule in this scenario.
The molecule is a chemical solvent that dissolves the superglue. It doesn't break the radio. It breaks the limitation of the tuner. The dial suddenly spins freely, and the radio receiver begins picking up all the frequencies at once. You hear the full spectrum of the electromagnetic field, the cosmic background radiation, the overlapping waves of non-local reality.
And this is the crux of the author's argument. The broader bandwidth isn't fake. The cosmic background radiation is undeniably real. It was always there, vibrating through the room. You just didn't have the hardware configuration to receive it.
Right.
The text argues that the psychedelic state, allows the human organism to consciously interface with the fundamental, non-local fabric of reality itself.
So, by the author's logic, the narrow band, the fixed 98.7 FM station of our daily ego, is the actual illusion. The unified, non-local geometry experienced during ego death is objectively more real than our everyday perception.
It demands a complete inversion of how we view sanity interception. The hyperdimensional space isn't a byproduct of a poisoned brain. It is the baseline architecture of the universe, finally visible because the brain's artificial filters have been dropped.
But if that is true, if ego death is a more accurate interface with reality and our daily sense of separation is an illusion constructed by our biology, it raises a massive, almost terrifying question.
Which is?
Why would nature do that to us? Why did human evolution spend millions of years building these rigid microtubular boundaries? Why did we evolve a default mode network that traps us in a hallucination of separation?
The author anticipates this and addresses it in the climax of the piece. The answer lies in the harsh realities of biology. The text concludes that the self is an orchestrated limitation of awareness. The phrase the author uses is the evolutionary veil.
An evolutionary veil, that implies we were intentionally blinded for a purpose.
We were blinded for survival. Think about the hominid environment. If you are an early human trying to survive on a brutal savanna, you cannot afford to walk around in a permanent state of macroscopic quantum coherence.
No, probably not.
If a saber-toothed tiger jumps out of the tall grass, you cannot be standing there perceiving the beautiful, non-local interconnectedness of your atoms and the tiger's atoms.
Right. You can't be admiring the unified ontological field while you are being actively digested. You need a fast, aggressive, highly localized system that yells, "That is a tiger, this is me, and I need to run away from it immediately."
And that system is the ego. The ego is an exquisite, highly advanced survival mechanism. It is a necessary constriction of infinite reality, designed solely to keep a biological organism alive long enough to reproduce.
So evolution had to build a veil to block out the overwhelming geometry of the quantum universe, just so that the organism could focus on the mundane tasks of finding calories and avoiding predators.
Exactly. But the author doesn't stop at evolutionary biology. They take this premise into a realm that bridges quantum mechanics with profound, almost mystical philosophy. Because the text states, the human brain did not evolve solely to survive the material world, but to occasionally dissolve back into the infinite.
It is the ultimate synthesis of the essay. It fundamentally reframes what a human being actually is.
It does.
Is the author seriously suggesting that evolution intentionally built a biological backdoor into our neurology? That nature built this rigid, protective ego so we can survive Tuesday through Saturday, but it intentionally preserved the 5-HT2A receptors and the microtubular tuning forks so that we could occasionally bypass the survival programming?
The author states it explicitly. The brain evolved to serve as an aperture through which the cosmos can intimately experience its own staggering geometry.
An aperture, a lens.
Consider the philosophical weight of that idea. Science traditionally views the human brain as a solitary survival engine for a local primate. This text argues that the brain is a sensory organ for the universe itself.
Mind-blowing.
The cosmos, over billions of years, generated biology, evolving it to be more and more complex, specifically so that the universe could eventually open an aperture and look back at its own infinite quantum complexity.
So when a person ingests a tryptamine, when the tuning fork strikes and the resonance shatters the cubicle walls and the DMN collapses, it is not just a human having a recreational drug trip. It is the universe briefly taking off the heavy, restrictive VR headset of human ego in order to remember what it actually is.
That is the staggering geometry the author is pointing toward. The molecule doesn't create the transcendent geometry. It simply opens the aperture wide enough for the underlying truth of existence to pour in.
And you can instantly see why this specific author is so fascinated by phenomena like Stendhal syndrome or the biology of crying. They are obsessed with these fleeting moments where the fragile human container simply cannot hold the sheer massive volume of reality trying to pour through it.
Right, the system overload.
Whether it's overwhelming art, profound grief, or a catalyzed quantum resonance, the theme is the exact same. The local biology breaking open to reveal the non-local infinite.
And ego death, as proposed by this Orch-OR ethicist, is the ultimate biological expression of that breaking point. The container doesn't just overflow, the container momentarily ceases to exist entirely.
Let's bring the vast cosmic scale of this theory intimately back down to the listener, because we have traveled incredibly far today.
We really have.
We started with basic neurochemistry, dug down into quantum superpositions inside microscopic cellular scaffolding, modeled the collapse of the brain's energy landscape, and ended with the universe using us as an aperture to view itself. It is a lot to process.
It is dense, but the implications for how we experience our daily lives are incredibly immediate and profoundly practical.
Precisely. So, to you, the learner listening right now, think about the architecture we just explored. The next time you find yourself feeling completely trapped by your life,
Yeah.
the next time you are overwhelmed by anxiety or feeling rigidly locked inside your own repetitive thoughts, exhausted by the relentless demands of your autobiographical self, remember this deep dive.
Remember that the rigidity you are feeling, that intense feeling of isolation and pressure, is a biological feature. It's an evolutionary filter. It is a heavy piece of survival hardware, but it's not the ultimate fundamental truth of your existence.
According to this staggering synthesis of biology and physics, your ego is just a highly orchestrated compartmentalization. It is just a massive effort of biological energy holding up a set of artificial walls to keep you safe in the material world. But beneath those walls, you are literally built with the hardware for profound non-local unity. The quantum scaffolding is already inside your cells. The tuning forks are inside you, waiting to resonate.
Which leaves us with the final lingering question straight from the climax of the source material. A question that completely inverts our relationship with reality.
Lay it on us.
If the localized ego is merely a biological restriction of quantum coherence, if your sense of being a separate, isolated individual is just a necessary evolutionary filter, and if ego death is simply the dismantling of that filter, returning us to our true baseline state of unified reality, then is your sober waking life the actual hallucination?